Welcome to Conversations with Coopman, Series 2, Making Sustainability Your Business, in association with One Tree Planted. One Tree Planted are a global non-for-profit reforestation organisation. Joining myself and Mark on this episode is Marie Gillespie, and Marie's going to talk to us about the sustainability movement and what she's seeing in the Irish market. Marie, you're very welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. I suppose as a starting point, Marie, when did you first become aware of sustainability as a movement, let's say?
Okay, so my background, I was a fund manager of Japanese equities for a very long time. And I suppose the first time I became aware of sustainability was back in 2010, when if you cast your mind back to what happened in 2010, Fukushima, and the tsunami and earthquake that happened at the time. And of course, everybody probably remembers the incident, but what you might not be aware of is that there were 54 nuclear reactors in Japan at the time that made up 30% of the total power production in Japan. And what happened, of course, is that when one power plant is hit with a tsunami that renders it inoperable, and obviously there's a major disaster, every single other power plant, as and when they came up for their annual inspection, wasn't allowed to restart. Because if you think about it, who could say that the tsunami walls were high enough and that, they were definitely safe? They were all, of course, on the coast. So I suppose as a fund manager, then what I was looking at was a lot of energy initiatives at the time, whether it was from the Prime Minister of Japan, and it was across the board, on top of which you had all the car companies, so the Toyota, the Honda, the Nissans of this world, looking at electric vehicles, of course. You had Panasonic looking at battery technology at the same time. You had Asahi Kasei, the chemicals company, looking at maybe some hydrogen technology, as well as some energy-saving methods in the house. So I suppose I was becoming aware of it from a number of angles in the Japanese context. But what I hadn't appreciated, I thought it was just one of these themes, in the same way that I was looking at the Tokyo Olympics and the infrastructure being built out, or aging population, the demographics there. But then when I moved across to the Irish market 3 years ago now, suddenly I was meeting all of the Irish companies, whether that was Kingspan with their insulation products, whether that was Smurfit Kappa with, the paper technology so that we use less plastic, or, frankly, across the board, Green Coat Renewables, all of them. So suddenly I was seeing this theme, not just from a Japanese context and indeed an Irish context, but because the Irish players in the market, by definition, have competitors in Europe and the US and elsewhere. Suddenly you realize this is a really big theme that's happening everywhere, and I don't think the market's looking at it yet.
But that's I think that's typical of Ireland, really, isn't it? It's always a number of years behind our counterparts elsewhere, and I suppose it is now the focus of these boards to drive this change. But from your perspective, what is driving it?
Yeah, first of all, I don't think it's fair to say that Ireland wasn't catching up to it yet. I don't think the market was catching up to it, because, I was working for an Italian fund manager, looking at international equity. So I think the market was slow to catch up in many the same way that you or I, might be going, how did I not realize 10 years ago that, buying all those coffee cups or whatever it might be, is really bad for the environment. You sort of go, gosh, why wasn't I thinking of it then? So I think the market was no different in that context. What's driving the change now? Look, it's coming. I nearly don't know where to start. It's coming from so many angles. So the first thing is the consumer. So consumers are beginning to realize that it's not just about the recycled coffee cup or driving the electric vehicle, that actually they can make their money matter in terms of financial products and how they save and how they use their savings or their pensions. So that's one element. Then there's a generational shift going on at the moment as well. So whether that's the generation, as the older generation pass on some of their money to the younger generation, who typically care more about how their money is invested. But there's also an increasing proportion of women that are making up a bigger portion of funds generally. And that transfer of wealth, statistically speaking, women care more about how their money is invested as well. So that's going on as well. Then at a company level, there's all sorts of reasons for looking more at sustainability. First of all, it's a hiring tool and a retention tool, because as I talk about that younger demographic that really care about where they work and what their own company's sustainability targets are. There's also a marketing tool, because quite frankly, sustainability sells, not to be too blasé about it, but that's a fact. And the good news in that regard is that there's more and more regulation around that. You can no longer just say, we're sustainable, that you actually have to prove it, which is great. And thirdly, it cuts costs for companies. So if you think about it, when you're more sustainable, you're basically wasting less. And so whether that's less energy or throwing away less product, or, less, or, the circular economy, looking at that as a company, by and large, you're going to cut costs. There may be some investment up front, but it's going to be very good for you. And then a really huge piece of the equation that I've left to last is regulation. And, I nearly don't know where to start on that. So, whether you're talking about central banks, there's a group of central banks that have gotten together, Network for Greening the Financial System. And this all started really, I suppose, with Mark Carney saying, this is a risk that we need to look at. And so central banks are going, we need to regulate for this. And therefore banks themselves are going, we need to look at physical risks from climate change. So whether that's, the risk of flooding or fires or drought or whatever it might be, depending on where your assets are. But there's also transition risks, which is to do with the regulations that might change going forward. What's going to come down the line that could impact us? Are those oil wells going to be worth the same amount of money in 10 years' time or 20 years' time? So that's the central bank level. Then you've got your government level. So particularly in Europe, obviously, we've got the European Green Deal. And within that Green Deal, what that means is that each and every single member state has to set out their targets for how they're going to achieve net zero by 2050. And in Ireland's case, we're setting out a climate bill, which is going to be a legally binding requirement to cut carbon emissions. There's going to be implications across the board. And of course, that depends country by country. So in Ireland, one of our biggest things would be we have a lot of agriculture, and how are we going to target that? Transport is typically another big emitter in many countries. So look, the makeup depends on which country you're looking at. But no matter which way you look at it, whether you're Germany, Ireland, France, you're going to have to set out how you're going to be net zero. And even the US is coming in that. Biden has made a big difference in how the US is looking at climate change. I think it's fair to say that his predecessor maybe just wasn't as concerned. So there's lots. And then on top of that, so you've got accounting regulations coming in. You've got sustainable finance disclosure regulations, which I kind of referenced earlier. In other words, if you tell people that you have a green product, it's no longer enough to say that you've got to actually go, here's what I mean by that, and here's the targets that I'm setting myself. So look, it's coming everywhere is the answer. I think from a company perspective, even if you don't believe in climate change, or you're completely agnostic about it all, the regulations themselves are driving your necessity to look at it.
Of course. And just on that point, because it's a vast, complex discussion, right? And a couple of trends I'm kind of hearing there is that, it's the younger demographic that's kind of pushing this change. Like if you look at all the top PLCs and who's at a board level, there stereotypically will be male, would you ever see resistance from board level about these changes? Because it just seems to be there's a lot happening, in such a short space of time. I'd imagine there would be, or what are your...
Well, so no company's going to go out there and say to you, we've met so much resistance. The funny thing that I find is that many companies now are saying, sustainability is part of our DNA. If I got a penny for every time I heard that quote, sustainability is part of our DNA, I'd be very rich. So I think a lot of companies are saying that they're all over this, and maybe, as I say, it could be a little bit of marketing or whatever. I think, though, underneath the covers, I think it's absolutely true that you're bound to meet resistance. And I know certainly in my conversations in the wider community and talking to people, I certainly have met resistance in the past. Typically, I would say from an older demographic generally.
Okay.
And when you look at all the things you talked about just a moment ago, Marie, you talk about companies having to look at their consumers, look at their products. There's new regulations that are going to dictate, what they have to do. And I know you referenced kind of sustainability gives an opportunity to cut costs, which can, make you more profitable. And potentially what ties into maybe some resistance to change is there, by going down this route, do firms and companies with their kind of short-term focus almost have to give up returns? Is that what it means, that they're going to give up returns, and that's maybe what could cause some resistance?
I think you might mean in share price terms. Am I correct?
Yeah, share price returns, yeah.
Yeah. So when you look at share prices, so the first thing to point out is that sustainability hasn't, from an investor's perspective, isn't new. It's been around for a long time. But I think what's new is that it used to be kind of something that was in the corner, or something that there was kind of an elite group of people that were looking at it. So in my time, when I would have started out in the industry, we had a lot of clients that were religious institutions, so the priests and the nuns, and they really, really cared about not so much where their money was invested, but where their money wasn't invested. So they didn't want alcohol, they didn't want tobacco, by God, they didn't want contraception, this kind of thing. So that's where it all started. But so it has been around for a long time. But there have been lots and lots of studies done. It is gaining traction, and there have been lots and lots of studies done recently about whether you're going to give up returns in share price terms by electing not to have certain stocks. And the good news is that there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever. In some cases, some studies have shown that you're going to have excess returns. But certainly, look, I could give you lots of studies. I'll just give you one. So Morgan Stanley, for example, did a study of 11,000 mutual funds between 2014 and 2018. And they found there was no financial trade-off whatsoever. So look, I think it's fair to say that as ESG becomes the norm, that you're certainly not going to get excessive or excess returns, which is what you've actually seen in the last year or two. But I don't think you're going to give up returns either.
Right. Okay. Moving on from there, like when we look at companies locally here in Ireland, what changes are you seeing in relation to sustainability?
Yeah, so what I find very interesting is, so I said I started to look at sustainability as a theme, within Ireland, certainly about 3 years ago was when I copped on that this was a really big change, the sea change that was happening. And I decided to go off and study. And as part of that, what I studied I asked a number of people how do I go about this? What qualification do I need? And the answer was, well, there isn't really one yet. But, within Ireland, and by the way, that's very dramatically changed in the last year or two. Everybody's at it. But within Ireland, the one name that came up again and again was Andreas Hopner of UCD Smurfits. People said to me, you should talk to him. So anyway, off I went and did a 6-month course with him, and that was great. And as part of that, we all had to do a project. And I decided to do my project on Irish equities because that's what I work in, that's what I know. I thought that's where I had the edge. And what I did was I sent out a survey to all of the listed Irish companies. I got a really, really good response rate, actually higher than the likes of the CDP, and said, I just asked them really basic questions because I wanted responses. I said, are you getting asked about ESG? What do you think of the EU taxonomy? And have you been directly impacted by climate change? And what was really, really evident to me at the time was that companies knew what ESG was. They were happy with that one. They were like, yeah, we've got tick that box. We know the answer to this question. That's fine. When I got into the taxonomy and when I got into climate change, it was really, really evident that companies wanted to know the answer, but didn't necessarily know the answer. Now, I'm obviously generalizing grotesquely. Some companies really were all over it, particularly, I would say, large caps and certain names were all over this. Look, we got this EU taxonomy, we have a problem with, Article X clause, whatever, and, we really think they need to look at that. But by and large, particularly the smaller caps, and depending on the sector that you were in as well, they were not on top of sustainability at all. They couldn't even agree on climate change. I had an example of companies that operating in the same space, essentially 2 companies in the same industry, one saying, climate change is a really big deal, and the other one saying, oh no, climate change, no impact whatsoever. So, but roll on a year. So I did this project in June 2020, so not much more than a year ago. And the conversation has changed really, really dramatically. Like, I'm quite shocked by it. So not only are companies talking and disclosing a lot around sustainability, but they're also appointing heads of sustainability left, right, and centre. And the conversation has moved really dramatically to the point where if they don't have several slides dedicated to sustainability as part of their earnings release, I'd be surprised and sort of wonder what was going on. I will say, though, that as a fund manager or as an investor, and this is the point, that you do need to look at exactly what they're saying, because, you can claim to have net zero targets, and that those net zero targets can be, we're planning to buy some carbon offsets in 2050. So it's, just because a company says it's sustainable doesn't mean it is. However, at least they recognise that it's an important topic of conversation and something that they need to be all over.
But that's it. Like, that's what companies are doing. Is they're trying to create a loophole so that they are perceived as being sustainable, when in actual fact in their day-to-day runnings they're actually not. But that's a conversation for another day, right? I suppose, as you've just said, deceleration up even within the period of 12 months, during a period of, let's just go, global pandemic as well. It's just been lots of challenges, right? So I suppose, where do you see the next maybe 2, 3, 5 years for these companies? Because it is, again, it's such a mammoth and complex issue.
Yeah.
Like, what do you? And again, I don't know. It's a very hard question to ask and answer, but where do you see this going realistically?
Well, from a company perspective, so I've made the point that, a year ago, that companies didn't really, some companies didn't really have strong opinions or strong knowledge in the area. I still think there's a big journey to go. So just because you appoint a head of sustainability doesn't mean that you automatically the following week or the following year have hit all your targets. So I think it's a journey, and I think that they're beginning to take that seriously. I think you're going to see an increasing amount of companies realizing that, that the investor has copped on to this, and that, setting these net zero targets isn't enough, that we need to clarify that, for example, we're including scope 3 emissions. We need to have midterm targets along the way, because, companies are a little bit like politicians. The CEO of a company, he's not going to be around in 10 years or 20 years time. So he can, make all the targets he wants if he doesn't actually, he or she, I should say,
yes.
if they don't have to be around. So those midterm targets are very important. I think you're going to see an increasing amount of disclosure, for example, towards science-based targets, so that, that you have a recognizable, an external body sort of looking at you, and you have a recognizable target. Also, TCFD, Task Force for Financial Disclosure. You'll see an increasing amount of companies disclosing through that as well. So that's on one side. And then I think in Ireland, depending on the country that you're looking at, I'm looking at Irish companies at the moment. As I say, you're going to see an increasing amount of pressure from the government, from central banks, from everywhere, and I think you're going to see more and more disclosure. I think you're going to see more and more data, because, as I say, that's one of the issues at the moment, that companies are going, well, this is great, these targets are great, but actually we haven't got a clue how to find our scope 3 emissions. Can you help us, please? I think there's going to be a lot more need for external companies to come in and help verify all that data, and I think you're going to see just more and more of the same, really. Not going away.
Like, I feel at the moment that, obviously, with COP26 happening now at the end of the month, and that there has to be a huge global governmental push. But I just feel that sometimes, sometimes are consumers ready for this yet? And what I mean, I'm talking about locally. Like, you're looking at carbon taxes are just being increased. They're talking about bringing in more electrical cars, but at the same time, do we have the infrastructure to allow those cars to drive in a couple of years' time? Is there ever going to be a case that we're going to put the cart before the horse, if that makes sense? Or because there's a lot of moving parts here, and everything has to move at the same time in the same way. Do you think there will be challenges, and who ultimately will be responsible for those challenges?
Yeah, the answer is there absolutely will be challenges. So there was an interesting, in one of the Irish newspapers last week, they had a headline whereby, consumers are all about the green, and then they were asked, did they want to pay higher petrol prices? And the answer was, surprisingly, no. Guess what? Yeah, we want to change the climate, but by goodness, don't make us actually pay for it. So yeah, I think there are going to be some challenges. I also attended, so there was an event last week in Ireland around sustainability and finance and whatever, Sustainable Finance Week. And one of the interesting discussions was around offshore wind, because, of course, in Ireland, one of the big assets that we have is that we have got a lot of wind. Generally, we didn't have good wind this summer, but generally we have very good wind. And one of the best ways would be to use offshore wind. But there are huge challenges around planning infrastructure, for example. So, if you want to build an offshore wind plant, guess what? You have to apply for planning permission, and that's holding things up. then, for example, we need some more infrastructure on ports. We need more infrastructure around, the transfer of electricity itself. So, arguably, we could actually become a net exporter of electricity in Ireland because we've got so much wind. We don't know what to do with it, for want of a better word. But, there are huge challenges that we have to overcome in the meantime. But I'd be pretty optimistic that certainly around wind, but also around other aspects that, we'll get there in the end. I just hope that we get there in time for 2030.
That's it, yeah.
I suppose just lastly from my side, Marie, and you kind of make the point there, hopefully we'll get there. I mean, you're in a unique position as a fund manager in some respects that you get to see, the consumer demand and also get an insight into what companies are doing in Ireland. With that viewpoint, do you think we're on the right track? Are we doing enough at this moment in time?
With regards to consumer demand?
Or just in regards to kind of the sustainability movement. Obviously, you've got the consumer demand putting pressure on companies. You've got the companies reacting. Are that happening together? Are we on the right track?
Yeah, so the answer is in Ireland. I think that I think every country could say they could be doing more. And I think in Ireland, we could definitely be doing more. And again, as part of the Climate Finance Week last week, they set out a roadmap for how, in terms of the industry and what the finance industry can be doing, because I think there's a recognition that this is important. And I think we need to do a lot more training and a lot more data sharing and knowledge. And I think that's recognized, and there's a roadmap there. On the consumer front as well, I think in terms of products that we're not necessarily there yet. When I say to people that I'm interested in sustainability, and I'm talking about, when I go down to my Pilates class or I'm outside the primary school picking up the kids, and I talk about it, people go, "Oh, you work in equities. What is that again? I have nothing to do with that. I know." And you're going, do you know what? Whether you know it or you don't, you have a pension. Yes. So, whether you think you're interested in the stock market or whether you think that you can have an impact, you absolutely can, because most of us, okay, maybe not everybody, has a pension, and how that is invested is really, really important. And there's a company in the UK that looks at it, and it's called Make My Money Matter, and they make all sorts of claims around how changing your pension is 21 times more effective than changing how much you fly or going vegan. Look, I have no idea if those claims are accurate. I don't know where they came from, but I think it's fair to say that that there's an increasing recognition that how we invest our pensions and how we invest our savings matters. And I don't think the product's there yet. And in particular, I don't see products, maybe just myself, but speaking as a female, I think that a lot of things are still aimed at the demographic that used to control all the money, and that I don't necessarily think that it's there for my demographic or for the younger demographic yet. And so I think it's all a case of developing over time.
Mm. Well, look, that's certainly a takeaway from this conversation, isn't it? That there's an opportunity there to really put products out there that people are looking for and are very much craving. I don't know if it is the right term, but this is a topic that we're engaging on because it is so great and complex, and it's going to continue to evolve. But I think you've been really great today in terms of kind of bringing the Irish elements to the front, and really giving some really good takeaways as to what the consumer demand looks like, but also what the key focus of the Irish equity market is as well. So thank you very much for your time, Marie. I'm sure if anybody has any questions or wants to kind of tap into your knowledge, that you'd be happy for them to reach out to you directly as well.
Absolutely, yep.
Perfect. Well, look, all the best for the remainder of the year and for everything that you're doing in this space. And we look forward to catching up with you again, maybe in the not so distant future, to see how we are progressing.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marie.
Thanks, Marie.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on Conversations with Coopman. If you are looking to hire excellent talent or considering your next career move in front office, risk, compliance, or accounting, please reach out to a member of our specialist recruitment team. If you have any questions about the financial services market, feel free to leave a comment below and we will get back to you soon. And if you like this podcast episode, we'd greatly appreciate a video like, or even better, subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with our latest releases.